Welcome, friends. In the last class, we talked about Orientalism. In this class, we'll be talking about two more powerful critics of post-colonial era, Frantz Fanon and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, who have contributed significantly to the understanding of post-colonial discourse. So, let us first of all talk about Frantz Fanon, who was one of the most powerful critics of his time, but unfortunately had a very short span of life. As you can see, born in 1925, he died in 1961. He was born in Martinique, trained in psychiatry in France, worked in Algeria. He was a psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary intellectual, and was inspired by people like Jean-Paul Sartre, uh, Lacan, Negritude movement, Marxism, uh, and in his writings he emphasizes upon colonialism, decolonization, and the psychology of operation. Some of his important works are Black Skin, White Masks, The Wretched of the Earth, A Dying Colonialism, Toward the African Revolution. So, first we talk about one of his most perceptive and effective essays called Black Skin, White Mask, Masks, that was published in 1952. It explores the psychological effects of colonialism and racism on black individuals, as how blacks have internalized the inferiority imposed by a racist society, and how this shapes their identity, relationships, and self perception. So, he talks about, as opposed to, Edward Said, who talks about Orientalism and how the culture of the East has been shaped and reshaped by the colonial discourse, as we discussed in the previous class. Here he is talking about not only the cultural and physical colonization of the colonized subjects, rather, he is talking about psychological colonization. And mind it, friends, the physical colonization might have gone from our country. We still find that we are psychologically colonized, because we look at ourselves from that colonial gaze, being the post colonial English educated intellectuals. So, the psychological effect of colonization was that the colonial subjects internalized inferiority. For instance, black people, especially in French colonies, were encouraged to adopt white language, customs, and values, creating a fractured identity. So, a black skin with a white mask. So, although they looked black, they mimicked the ways of their masters, and tried to put on a white mask so that they can conceal their black selves. So the colonized subjects learned to see themselves through the colonizer's gaze, leading to self hatred, alienation, and a desire to be white. And this is much more dangerous than the physical or political colonization, because the political or physical colonization might go someday, but if you are psychologically colonized, that impacts a very thought process, and you continue to think like that and never come out of that. So, colonialism is not just political domination, it's also psychological colonization. Fine. So, he describes the relationship between colonizer and decolonized through two kinds of violence. Says the violence of the colonizer through annihilation of body, psyche, culture, along with the demarcation of space, and the violence of the colonized as an attempt to retrieve dignity, sense of self, and history through anti colonial struggle. So, we always find that Frantz Fanon, who believes that colonization is not only a political and sociological phenomenon, rather, it is also a psychological phenomenon, and violence is embedded in it. And this violence is not one sided, this is two sided. So, the violence is used by the colonial masters to perpetuate and exercise their authority over the colonized subjects. On the other hand, the colonized subjects also indulge in violence in order to fight the unjust treatment meted out to them by their colonial masters in an attempt to regain, retrieve their dignity, self respect, and also their history and culture through their colonial anti colonial struggle. So, Fanon argues that it creates a sense of double consciousness where black individuals view themselves through the eyes of white society. We find that, they are made to believe that their culture is inferior, their ways of doing things are primitive, irrational, kind of savage or uncivilized, and as a result, they start to think, or they start to emulate whatever their colonial masters do, resulting in a strange kind of double consciousness where, their own native consciousness is dominated or doubted because of their newfound consciousness which they have borrowed from their masters. Blacks striving to prove their intelligence becomes futile as the language construction, a tool of domination used by whites, makes them feel inferior, reinforcing identity crisis. So, during colonization, what happened, the languages of the natives were wiped out. They were rendered, you know, unusable in the name of civilizing them. They were given English language and they were made to feel that their language is inferior, and if they speak English they become superior. This way it resulted in a sort of identity crisis where these people lost their own voice and learned something that was alien to them and which they could not master to an extent where they can compete with the natives. So, Fanon considers the fact that many black men desire white women because they want to engage in the vengeful act of dominating a European woman. So, as I said, this double consciousness and violence, they are embedded in this kind of colonized discourse. And here we find that those colonized subjects, they always try to pay back to their colonizers in some form or the other. Fanon builds his psychological inquiry on a remark, and I quote, "Look, a Negro," and elaborates on the existence of a collective unconscious of black people and argues that the only way for black people to be healed from the psychological damage of colonialism is through collective catharsis. So, they have not suffered individually, rather, they have suffered as a group, as a culture, and if any kind of damage control has to be done, or any reclamation of their past has to be done, or culture has to be done, this also has to be a collective effort and for the whole people. So, if one individual comes out of this vortex of colonialism and starts believing in his culture and his identity, it will make little change unless and until the whole people, think like that. In the case of negrophobia, fear or hatred of black people, the problem is actually rooted in racist colonial culture where such people, the black people, have traditionally been, stereotyped as irrational, dangerous, and having potential of criminal activities. So we find that the same gets reflected in many of the diasporic texts as well. Especially, we can quote an example from V.S. Naipaul's The Mimic Man, and we find that the colonial subjects trying to, because that was also a kind of civilizing mission. They were under the control of their colonial masters, so they were always forced to emulate and behave like them. So in The Mimic Men, and I quote, we pretended to be real, to be learning, to be preparing ourselves for life. We mimic men of the new world. So, as if they did not exist prior to their colonial masters taking over them. And so they are taught how to live, how to dress, how to speak, and they are prepared for what they call the real life or the new world. But the matter of the fact is, they existed, they had their culture, they had their language, they had their identity, but now that has all been rendered useless and nullified. So we find that Naipaul's Ralph Singh embodies Fanon's idea. He is a colonial subject trying desperately to mimic the colonizer's manners, speech, and values. Like Fanon's, I quote, black man wanting to be white. Singh wears a mask of British civility but feels hollow and alienated underneath. So, friends, if you recollect, once I talked about how the Indians have appropriated or misappropriated some of the colonial traditions and manners and mannerisms. Let's say, whenever we find some of our functionaries, wearing black coat as part of their profession, even in 45 degrees in India and sweating profusely, it certainly makes us feel pity for them and also makes us realize the futility of such an exercise or such a custom. But then this is all, we can say, colonial given, which continues to govern the lives of the colonial subjects. The title itself, The Mimic Men, echoes from Fanon's idea about the colonized being reduced to mere mimics of their colonizers, never truly accepted. So, earlier also, while talking about mimicry, by Bhabha, we have seen the same thing being echoed, that uh, the colonial subjects trying to mimic or imitate their colonial masters end up being neither here nor there. So they neither remain Indians nor do they become Britishers, and they end up making a mockery of the British by imitating them so badly. So even in Bharati Mukherjee's Jasmine confides, she says, I changed my name and my clothes and the way I talked. I learned to walk differently, to use my hands like an American, to use forks, to fake modesty, to fake authority. And why? Why so? Because she has to survive in the US, and if she has to survive in the US, she has to be like them. But unfortunately, racially, she can be always othered. So Jasmine undergoes multiple transformations. We find the Jyoti of Hasnapur, a remote Punjab village, to Jasmine of Jalandhar, a city woman, to Jace in New York, to Jane in Iowa, she migrates from India to America and goes through several transformations, trying to adapt or trying to take on the mask of a new identity. And each new identity for her is a mask adapted to the expectations of different white dominated spaces, because she has to survive there, and that's why she tries to copy them and live like them. So, like Fanon's analysis, Jasmine's journey also shows how the colonized or diasporic subject is forced to constantly reinvent and alienate themselves to be recognized as human in a racially structured world. In The Wretched of the Earth, he talks about the psychological and psychiatric analysis of dehumanizing effects of colonization upon individual and the nation. And according to Fanon, the act of decolonization will always involve violence. As I earlier said, it is a two-way violence by the colonizers for perpetuating their authority, their power, their dominance on the colonized subjects. On the other hand, the violence by the colonized people to, come out of that domination. So he refers to the colonial world as a Manichaean world that is divided into light and dark, in which the white colonizers are seen as the light and the black colonized individuals are viewed as darkness and the epitome of evil. So, friends, we can take a leaf out of our earlier discussion on Orientalism, where we exactly talk about the same thing, where we find that all the positives, all the good is associated with, Occident, while all negatives are attached to the Orient. So here again we find that the colonizers hold the key. They are the chief referents. They are the epitomes of beauty, truth, and everything that is, sublime or profound. On the other hand, the colonized subjects are to be loathed at, because they don't possess any of these qualities. So, in this book, he proposes a discussion on personal and societal mental health, the use of language or vocabulary um, that uh, established to imperialist identities, psychologically molding the slave and master relationship, and role of intellectualism in revolution. And this is again, we find the same reflected in, the diasporic texts. Here I can uh, quote an example from the shadow lines by Amitav Ghosh, and I quote, "It is a shadow line, you cannot see it, but it's there, separating people who once shared homes and languages." So obviously this, uh, partitioning of people is always there. Ghosh explores how colonial boundaries, especially partition, created violent ruptures in Indian identity and space. And this was again, everybody knows, this again was conceived, perceived, and supported by the colonial powers. So, partition is a form of colonial violence, one that fractures people not just physically but psychologically. And we find how cleverly the Britishers, in the name of liberating us, fractured this country forever. And even after so many years, this continues to be a problem for us. As a sovereign nation, we could never enjoy the same kind of, peaceful environment, and we continue to fight. So this was again a colonial violence of a different sort, in which A colonized nation was partitioned by the colonial powers and was left to bleed even at the outset of its freedom. So, Fanon's call for reclaiming historical agency and fighting the psychological trauma of colonialism is seen in how Ghosh's characters struggle with fragmented memory and identity. So, Fanon calls for reclaiming one's history and agency, and this may be possible only if we can psychologically come out of the colonization. The second critic is equally very important. Her name is Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, and she was born in Calcutta. She is an Indian, educated in Indian and American universities. She was the student of celebrated critic Paul Deman, translated and wrote preface to one of the most authoritative texts of postmodernism, Derrida's of grammatology, post structuralism rather, translated and presented critical notes on Mahasweta Devi's short stories, and alongside other writings by her centered on the discussions of post colonialism, deconstruction, feminism, Marxism, and Freud. And she was awarded the third highest civilian award given by the Republic of India, the Padma Bhushan, in 2013. Her most important and powerful contribution is her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And it addresses how the subaltern woman is constructed, absent, or silent, posing a question of whether the people at subordinate positions have the authority to speak. So she borrows this term from Antonio Gramsci, and her subaltern refers to women, black and colonized, and the working class. In a way, the people belonging to lower or inferior rank. And in post colonial terms, it refers to the colonized mass who are socially, geographically, and politically excluded from the hierarchy of power, and so do not have right or authority to voice themselves. So, subalterns are those who belong to the third world countries and are divided on the basis of caste, class, creed, gender, color, uh, etc. And Chakravarti Spivak argues that the power structures lying within the social, economic, and political hierarchy silence subaltern voices even when they attempt to speak. And that's why this question, whether the subaltern can speak for themselves. She differentiates between the representation as speaking for someone, this is Wörterfen in German, and representation as representation of someone's experience, that is Darslin. When intellectuals try to give voice to the subaltern, they often reinforce their own authority rather than truly enabling subaltern agency. So, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak says that, these so called marginal people do not have a voice of their own, or even if they try to speak on their behalf, their voice is silenced, erased, or brushed under carpet. And there are other people who speak on their behalf. But the fact is, the other people who speak on their behalf, their authenticity and their authority, agency, and intentions are always questionable. With the example of sati practice in India, she pointed out how both British colonialists and indigenous elites spoke for the subaltern woman, one to abolish the practice, the other to preserve it, but neither actually let her speak for herself. So while the British considered it, this practice of sati pratha in India, brutal and uncivilized for women, and the Indians went for perpetuation of it in the name of true honor and custom, nobody really bothered to ask whether the women who are being talked about have a say in that, whether they side with the uh, British colonialist view or they subscribe to the views of indigenous elite. So, in fact, they are being spoken for rather than speaking themselves. So, the dominant discourse of the West set the tone. White men saved brown women from brown men, pointing out Indians as barbarians and the British as civilized, and this, justified the colonization of India. So, this is how, the entire discourse is placed by this Western academia to make people feel that, they are civilized people, they take care of their subjects and they are needed. On the other hand, the people they govern are not capable of rational thought, are neck deep into superstitions, false beliefs, and they are barbarous rather than civilized. So, hence, women are doubly marginalized. But then again, when we talk about women as subalterns, we find that they are not only marginalized by the colonial and capitalist structures, but they are also marginalized by their own native patriarchal systems. And so both these systems take away their voices and speak for them or on behalf of them rather than allowing them to speak. So we find that this is, reflected in many works like Maps for Lost Lovers by Nadeem Aslam. Kaukab, a Pakistani immigrant woman in Britain, is depicted as isolated and unable to communicate outside her ethnic enclave due to language barriers and cultural expectations, and as a result, the males speak on her behalf. Likewise, in Brick Lane by Monica Ali, we find how Nazneen, a Bangladeshi immigrant in London who is a diasporic subaltern, she faces cultural and linguistic barriers, and her attempts at self expression is often mediated or dismissed by her husband and the wider society as if she does not exist or she does not have appropriate voice to speak on her own behalf. So she is also a critic of post colonial reason. um, she talks about a critic of post colonial reason towards a history of the vanishing present, in which she expands her ideas introduced in Can the Subaltern Speak, examining how colonial and neo colonial power structures shape knowledge productions, continuously marginalizing subaltern voices. She argues that colonialism did not simply oppress its subjects but actively erase their subjectivity by forcing them into the framework of European thought. So, this is what we have been talking about, how systematically our culture and our thought process was completely erased, and we are made to believe that we are uncivilized brutes not capable of any kind of rational thought. And so she says that colonialism did not only oppress the subjects but also erase their subjectivity, their identity, their language, their culture. and they were made to believe and behave as prescribed by their colonial masters. So she draws inferences from 19th century British novels like Jane Eyre and The Heart of Darkness, in which the characters are positioned uh, as either savage or mystical. She argues that these texts create a sanctioned ignorance, a condition where colonial subjects are never fully represented, only constructed through the lens of Western superiority. So, again, it comes very close to our understanding of the Orient, which was imaginatively created by the Western academia or Western discourse in a certain garb, as exotic, as romanticized, as eroticized, and so on and so forth. Here again, we find that using their sanctioned ignorance, they are providing us a vision of this part of the world in their own understanding, not as it exists objectively, but as it appears to themselves or as it serves their colonial project or purpose. So again, she talks about diaspora, old and new, women in the transnational world in this essay, which was published in 1996. She distinguishes between old diasporas resulting from factors like war, slavery, and religious oppression, and new diasporas that are primarily driven by economic migration and political asylum seeking, with a notable emphasis on gender dimensions of these movements. She critiques the neoliberal global economy's impact, especially on women, and highlights how transnational capitalism disproportionately exploits female labor, particularly through unregulated home based work and population control policies targeting impoverished women. So, she introduced the term genocide to describe the systemic violence inflicted upon women under the guise of development and reproductive policies. She emphasizes the necessity for a decolonized approach to transnational feminism, one that acknowledges and addresses the intersections of economic exploitation, cultural marginalization, and gendered labor. And this is again very important when we go through the diasporic fiction. So, friends, this understanding of Frantz Fanon's and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's ideas will again, provide us lenses through which we can look at these texts and their formations and can really find meaning in them. So, we continue this theoretical discussion, taking up some more theoretical formations that are useful for our proper understanding of the fiction of Indian diaspora. So, for now, thank you very much for your company. I look forward to you joining me for the next class. And in the next class, again, we talk about some more aspects of the theoretical formations around diasporic texts. So, thank you very much.